So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed panelists, thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to launch this roundtable before such a diverse and experienced panelist list. I'm humbled by the presence of so many industry experts and leaders, each bringing invaluable insight and perspectives. As we gather here at COP29, often referred to as the Finance COP, we are reminded of the immense task ahead of us. Finance is the fuel for climate action. We need substantial amounts of capital to drive this transition, most of them for the energy transition. Our Deloitte study, Financing the Green Transition, estimates it can exceed $7 trillion annually through 2050. However, the reality is that we are not meeting these investment needs. Current capital flows towards the energy transition remain below $2 trillion per year, and projections for 2024 are no better. The financing gap is huge, yet the energy transition is the best funding sectors within overall climate finance. The financing gap is even more staggering when we look at the climate finance, including adaptation, loss and damage, and other mitigation pillars. The question of why this investment shortfall exists is complex, but one thing is clear. The barriers are not the same everywhere and for all the technologies. Solutions must be tailored to specific context. Doing so, we can both accelerate the transition and reduce its cost by 25% according to our analysis. At COP29, we are on the eve of pivotal decisions on this, as the parties are negotiating and will settle on the next new collective quantified goal on climate finance during those 12 days. A goal we expect to be more aligned with actual need than the previous 100 billion target. The COP29 presidency has shown commendable leadership in supporting climate action on the finance side through various initiatives. These include the Climate Finance Action Fund, timely events on just transition and green growth, and the launch of the Baku Initiative on Climate Finance, Investment and Trade. These efforts are crucial but not sufficient. We must acknowledge the enormity and complexity of the task at hand. Financing the energy transition encompasses a broad spectrum of issues, and every actor in the market has a vital role to play. One thing is clear: we need dialogue, knowledge sharing, multi-layer and multi-sectoral action, and cooperation among all the stakeholders, from governments to commit bold investment and to create suitable conditions for even more active private sector engagement based on business cases with a clear risk profile. Today, we are extremely lucky to have such a panelist group who represent a wide array of stakeholders, each bringing a unique value, unique vision, expertise, and approach to this vital issue. I'm eager to hear from you, esteemed panelists, on how we can forge our path towards a more sustainable and resilient future for all. Thank you, and let the discussion begin.
Thank you very much, Sami. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests. My name is Johannes Trüby. I'm a partner at Deloitte, where I'm responsible for a service called Energy and Climate Economics, and I'll be your moderator today. We've got a fabulous, knowledgeable, and diverse panel here with us. Let me please introduce to you Stefan Wintels. He's the CEO of KfW Banking Group. We have Pradeep Kurukula-Surya. He's the Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Development Fund. And we have Emily Krebs. She's Head of ESG at Deutsche. We have Wade Crowfoot, Secretary at the, I need to look at my notes, California Natural Resource Agency. Thank you very much. And we have Kristy Balsanek. She's partner and global co-chair ESG at DLA Piper. And we have Omer Farooq, head of sustainable asset finance at Bank of America. To kick things off, I'd like to zoom in a little bit into the challenges of financing the green energy transition. I'm an energy guy, so I'd just like to take a quick perspective on funding energy projects in especially the Global South. The technologies we need for the transition, these are windmills, solar panels, loads of batteries, heat pumps, and direct reduced iron plants, and so on. They are very, very capital intensive. And the challenge with this capital intensity means that, for example, the levelized cost of electricity of a windmill or a solar panel is primary capex. Whereas today, if, for example, you build a natural gas-fired power plant, your levelized cost of energy is to a large degree OPEX for the gas that you buy and burn. So with this transition, we're entering a very capital-intensive world. And what that implies is that the cost of capital becomes a major component of, for example, the levelized cost of energy, the levelized cost of hydrogen, and so on. And the cost of capital at the end of the day is an economic indicator of risk. And unsurprisingly, this risk perception is much larger in developing countries where, as we calculate in our study, the vast majority, around 2/3 of the investments would need to happen. And we have actually calculated in this study, the Deloitte study that I invite you to look at, is that the difference in just financing costs can make a green hydrogen project in Southern Africa worse off than the same green hydrogen project in, let's say, Spain or Italy, despite much better resource conditions, just because the financing is so costly. Now, against the backdrop that we need capital to flow to the Global South to finance this decision, tackling this difference in capital cost between the advanced economies and the Global South is of utmost importance. Stefan, my first question goes to you. Blended finance is absolutely essential to lower this capital cost, especially in developing countries. And developing banks like KfW play a very important role in providing finance instruments, blended finance instruments, concessional finance, and so on. From your perspective, what would be necessary to significantly expand blended finance and bring more private capital to the Global South? And maybe in the same vein, do development banks today, from your perspective, have what it takes to play their part in ensuring the green transition can be financed? Or do you see major remaining barriers?
So first of all, many thanks for the invitation to Deloitte to bring this panel together to a very important question. We as KfW remain incredibly committed to climate financing, both in the developed and developing worlds. We operate in 80 countries. Most of them are in the developing world of this planet, and we should not distinguish between North and South, because this is one planet, and we need to tackle this challenge together, and everybody has his role and his responsibility. Germany has the big advantage being a AAA country, and therefore our cost of capital are lower structurally than many countries we operate. KfW operates in developing countries through 3 lenses. We have a development bank in our group where we benefit directly from taxpayers' money, German taxpayers' money, in providing, for instance, policy-based loan to certain countries like Indonesia. And that is very important. The joint energy just transition partnerships which Germany and others have established in combination with country plans is a very powerful tool to provide a long-term perspective on a country-by-country perspective through different sectors, which contributes to de-risking projects. So what countries can do to de-risk is, for instance, to have these plans and vet them with banks like ourselves or with other stakeholders. That is very important from my perspective because the country risk needs to go down from a global perspective, and that is one measure to reduce the country risk. But we have also KfW IPEX. We are one of the world's largest project and export financier, and there we benefit from the guarantee capacity the world is providing, whether Korea, whether UK, but also Germany via Euler Hermes, where we again de-risk with the capacity of the country backing and the insurance capacity projects. And that is important because you rightly pointed out this energy transition is very capex oriented, and we have 3 major areas: infrastructure, energy efficiency, and renewable energies. All of them, and energy efficiency to a lesser extent, are capex driven. Long-term risks, etc., etc., and we can go in all details, but that's the instruments we are using. And worldwide, for large, scalable green projects, financing, from my perspective, is not the issue. And the third element is DEG, where we have employed more than 1 billion in small businesses, because despite the need to scale and to accelerate, it's important also that we scale small solutions to bring energy to the people on the ground. There are 700 million people who have no access to energy on this planet. It's almost 10%, and therefore smaller, scalable solution is equally important, and that's what we support. Overall, I think we have the instruments. I think we have the corporate finance techniques. I'm already 30 years in this industry. I don't think there is innovation. It's just execution and capacity. And the World Bank reform, for instance, where Germany is a driving force, is so important that the World Bank has now combined the guarantee scheme under MIGA and has hence increased the capacity, which will support in particular developing countries which have a cost of capital disadvantage.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Pradeep, you know the challenges of accessing climate finance very well, and UNCDF plays a very, very important role in helping countries to access climate finance and blended finance solutions. Can you tell us a little bit more about the specific challenges of developing countries, and perhaps especially the least developed countries, in making green investments? And also in this context, what solutions would you envisage to accelerate the transition and channel money, especially private money, towards the green transition?
Sure, happy to. First of all, thank you very much for having us. I'm from the UN Capital Development Fund, not a very well-known UN entity, but it does exist. It's been here since 1966, to the surprise of many. And it's the only UN platform that can deploy loans and guarantees as well as grants outside of IFAD, the International Fund for Agriculture Development. But unlike IFAD, we're not credit rated, so we're not a bank. We're a UN platform. We're grant funded, donors and philanthropy foundations. And our whole reason for existence is to go out and take risks. Some would call crazy risks. And I'm going to talk about 3 examples which everybody warned us against, but we did it anyway. And I think this is the bit of magic that needs to be unleashed. The first all countries need to raise finance. And right now, in this conversation on climate, they can go to various public sources that have been set up under the UN framework of climate change, and in general, it's an important avenue through which countries can access finance. But it does have its challenges, and we hear a lot about that from countries who talk about the time that it takes to access finance, the amount of resourcing that's available, and so on and so forth. So what we have been focusing on, number one, is to try and see if we can unleash domestic private capital towards various priorities. I mean, already governments are spending a lot of their public money on adaptation and mitigation, which is not very well recognized, but they are. But there's also the opportunity to unleash private capital. And one of the things we did, which everybody warned us against, was to support a subnational water authority in Tanzania to issue a water bond. Everyone said, don't do it. You'll waste the donors' money. We said, no, let's try it. We think it's safe enough and it will work. The Tanga water bond, with a $1 million investment, raised $23 million. 65% of it was from domestic investors. It was just that it was priced appropriately. That's not where the magic ended. The government then listed it in the stock exchange of Tanzania, and about 4 weeks ago, they went and cross-listed it in Luxembourg. So don't tell me it's impossible until it's done, right? Number one. Number two, we are about taking risks, and that means investing at the last mile. Kenya is a country that has a huge problem with food waste, agriculture waste. About 40 to 70% of produce gets wasted before it actually ends up in markets. So what we did was we gave a local financial service provider a loan of about 10, 12 million euros, I forget the exact amount. But that money essentially acted as a guarantee for that local financial service provider to then on-lend specifically for cold chain developers, right? That is catalyzing, mobilizing finance in markets that otherwise, this would not have happened. So it's that type of investment that we try and make. And I think our capability in the UN, as a UN platform, also allows us to go beyond just helping countries raise money and to take on first loss positions in various schemes. It also allows us to, I think, as someone said yesterday, so I'm going to use their phrase, not mine, but bank with a heart. And this really came to us to the forefront with a transaction we had supported in Zambia a few years ago, where we had taken a position with a loan for a startup that wanted to produce clean energy for farmers. And they succeeded. They had a great business model. They were able to, with our initial capitalization of about $500,000 to $1 million, they were able to raise about $3-4 million. It worked beautifully. About 10,000, 12,000 farmers were able to get access to clean energy until the Southern African drought hit. Then what happened? The farmers stopped making payments. The companies stopped making payments to us, and it effectively became a distressed asset. And of course, in those situations, what happens? Either the company collapses or someone comes to buy that over. In this case, there was another company that came to buy it over, but only if the existing debt on that balance sheet was reduced to 30 cents on the dollar. And of course, I asked my team, what's happening? What are the other investors doing? Well, they're all cutting their losses and they're leaving. And so what do you want to do? And I said, well, look, if I do what the market does, there is no point to our existence. So I said, let's stay in and let's go back in with additional resources and help this new company through this difficult period. Why? Not because it makes financial sense, it doesn't, but because we can. We are the UN. We're supposed to be the last line between, prosperity and disaster. And in this case, this company didn't have a bad business model, just that they were fighting the elements. And I think the market needs that kind of support, particularly at the last mile, where things are imperfect, and you need to be able to provide this type of assistance. It doesn't take a lot, but the impact can be quite transformational. So that's what we do in a nutshell, and I hope these examples are giving you a sense of what the realities are that countries face at the front line, particularly those that are effectively C-grade. I'll make the final point. One is, there's a lot of investment out there, but one of the issues that countries are facing is that a lot of it is flowing through credit-rated institutions. Credit-rated institutions that are highly regulated and that they themselves have constraints in how much risk they can absorb. And until we find a situation where we come together and make use of our different capabilities and connect the dots, it's going to be challenging to take on the kind of risks that we're talking about in some of these markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep, and I confirm the examples are very good because they help make a very, very complex subject quite tangible and actually seeing their stuff happening on the ground and the way it works. Turning to you, Emily, from the perspective of a private bank, is it attractive to do green investments in developing countries today? And also, what's from your experience, what is needed to make green projects in developing countries bankable?
Well, yes, it's always attractive to do investments when they're priced appropriately, to take a word from Pradeep. But I couldn't agree more with both Stefan and Pradeep. It takes that ecosystem to solve the problems that we're talking about here today across the road in the blue zone as well. And the constraints are real. Deutsche Bank, we are a global financial institution, but we have constraints in terms of what we can do. Our investors have constraints in terms of what they can invest in, and that risk profile is real. And when we talk about bringing private capital to the table, it's not Deutsche Bank opening up our checkbook and writing a check. It's us helping facilitate access to capital from investors in a market return type environment. And so that's where the work that KfW does, the work that I'm just going to say the UN does, because I'm not going to remember the correct CDF does. And MIGA and the other institutions is so important in terms of driving that. I think the other lens that I want to make sure we bring into the conversation when we talk about green energy transition is the just transition. And one of the things that we've seen in a market rate environment as we start thinking about financing in the Global South is some of the transactions that we've seen coming out of, for example, the Republic of Colombia. So they did financing earlier this year that was sustainable finance, and there are projects associated with it. Now, they're absolutely tied to the energy transition, but they're tied to benefiting the society at large. And so in some cases, that's energy access, but it's also done in a way that can benefit the people, and we start thinking about that just transition. So whether we're talking about the Global South, and I certainly take the guidance on we shouldn't be talking about Global South, Global North, but when we're talking about developing countries and how we drive access to energy or access to equity in terms of capital, we have to think about the jurisdictions in which we're talking about and how we can not just de-risk, but provide the appropriate type of capital for that jurisdiction and not through a lens of where we may sit today. And when I say that, I happen to sit in New York, our headquarters happen to be in Frankfurt, so how do we make sure that if we're financing in Southeast Asia that we're providing the most appropriate financing to that level? So I'd echo the comments, it takes a value chain, and the answer is yes, but it has to be priced appropriately for the market to ensure that it can be there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emily, and I really appreciate the point about the tailored solutions, is because I think when we look at climate finance, everybody's hoping for silver bullets and simple answers, but I think from my perspective, it's very, very important to look at each individual project, look at each individual jurisdictions, and the specific needs there to find the right solutions. Omer, turning to you. I have a very similar question for you than for Emily. Is from your perspective, how can we get finance flows coming to green projects to the north, and also from the same perspective, bankability. To what degree is it an issue for in your work in financing, climate finance, and what is needed to improve the flows?
Yeah. So first, I don't know if this is working. Try this one. Sorry, we got enough mics. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, and thank you. It's been a great panel so far. My name is Omer Farooq. I'm from Bank of America. I'm responsible for our sustainable asset finance business. I'll give a 30-second commercial on Bank of America. So we are a large institution. We're guided by, when it comes to climate, we have two guiding North Stars, net zero by 2050 and 1.5 trillion in capital mobilized by 2030. And within that, my role is sustainable asset finance, which effectively means project finance for assets that align with the UN SDG goals. That ends up being a lot of wind, solar, offshore wind, residential solar, electric vehicles, geothermal, so on and so forth. We're a global business. We have offices in Singapore, London, Paris, New York, etc. Look, I think the question of how do you unlock private capital. And I think when we say private capital, we're talking about the whole stack, and everybody plays in a way a different position, right? The role that banks are going to play is going to be different than the roles that KfW is going to play, different than a asset manager will play. So for us, I'll second what Emily said, we are a regulated commercial bank. Our role is to help scale, right? And when we look at frameworks where that has been successful, I think there's a couple of driving forces. One, the regulatory framework in the country has to be supportive. And that is a little bit deeper than just having incentives. It means, like sometimes we look at jurisdictions and we say, okay, well, the offtake contract looks really good, but there's no secondary source of repayment because the market doesn't allow you to sell power freely, right? So the framework has to support private capital coming in, and that is how the power markets are structured, how the legal contract law works, how developed, how easy it is to get money in and get money out of the country, what are the currency regulations. So it's pretty deep, and it is case by case. So we have to make sure that the regulatory framework is supporting private capital. Currency comes up, all the time. It is, these long contracts are long term. The amount of debt that is required to make the cost of capital work requires, fairly long-term tenors, and we have to be really cognizant and very, thoughtful about how to take that currency risk. And what you'll find is, as you're in the developing world, that these risk management tools of currency hedging, rate hedging, insurance are not always fully developed, right? So we need that market to develop and be there to support the lending. When it comes to technical risks, most of what we see from a scaling perspective is wind and solar, and we feel good about the technology there. There are new entrants to the market, so you have to do your diligence. But transmission remains an issue that is, I think, whether you're developed market or emerging market, you're always thinking and worried about transmission. So, look, I would say there are bankable projects. It is jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions are ahead of others. We've seen, we do a decent amount of business in India. We've seen that market really grow. And if you think about it, their offtake contract structure, they've made real regulatory changes to incentivize private capital, and they've seen that fruit. And some jurisdictions are behind, right? So it'll take time. It'll take a lot of, effort across stakeholders to really get everybody to work on the same page and replicate models where they've been successful.
Do you mind sharing? Yeah. Short of micros. Thank you very much, Omer. Moving on to you. Public institutions got an awful lot of instruments in their toolkit to de-risk projects, green projects. And California, where you're from, has been particularly successful as a driver of the energy transition with very, very impressive build out of renewables and modern technologies. From your perspective, what are sort of the lessons learned you can share, and also what are especially the lessons learned on subnational approaches to getting the green transition off the ground?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And if there may be some people in the room like me that don't understand a lot of the intricacies of finance, but I think this conversation between government and finance is really important. So I want to share at sort of the highest level some context. To me, there are two very obvious facts that are the foundation of what brings us here. One is we need to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, and two is there is not enough public money on this planet to actually solve the problem. So I think what we're dealing with across the road in the blue zone is really this question of finance. This is the finance COP, and there's two conversations. One is government to government financial transfers, essentially wealth transfers, and that's a challenging conversation. And what we're seeing is that some of the richest countries in the world are having real trouble following through on their commitments. While I think everybody can understand the justice that's involved in actually transferring resources to the poorest countries in the world that are the most impacted from climate change while having the least responsibility for it, the fact is there are political challenges with deploying the amount of taxpayer funding in richer countries and bringing them to poorer countries. And if we look at the need, what we hear is trillions of dollars. And if we listen to the conversation across the road, rich governments are having difficulty raising tens of billions of dollars for this transfer. So then that brings us to the question of how do we deploy private capital? And that's, of course, this whole discussion around high integrity carbon markets. How do we put a price on carbon that actually drives this? So I'll share, I think, from California's perspective, what's worked and what we're still learning. In California, we benefit from two things. We represent a state that is populated by people that want us to take action on climate change. So much like Germany, for example, there is a strong political license to actually drive forward. And the other thing we have in California is scale. Measured by GDP, our state is the 5th largest economy in the world. So therefore, we can actually set targets and implement regulation and policy that actually markets respond to. So I want to give you 3 quick examples of programs that have worked in California. The first is our cap and trade system. We put a cap or a limit on stationary sources of pollution, and that declines over time. But while that happens, and that guaranteed pollution decline happens, we auction off the credits for emissions within that. Since the inception of that program, that's generated $28 billion that we've then reinvested into California's transition, including into people's pocketbooks. One of the reasons why 1 out of 4 vehicles now sold in California is a zero-emission vehicle is we've provided a rebate for California consumers for purchasing these vehicles for the last decade, and it's been remarkably successful. So our cap and trade system is a good example from my perspective on creating a pollution reduction program that puts a price on carbon and then reinvests. The second is what we call our low carbon fuel standard. So we're still producing and using a lot of fossil fuel in California. So we've developed a program that requires if you're producing fossil fuels or importing fossil fuels in California, you have to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel. And you can do that either by changing your fuel mix or innovating or buying credits from other companies that are innovating. And that regulation has actually provided significant sort of pathways to investment for some really innovative low carbon fuels. The third is just something that happens in a lot of places, which is a procurement standard. We regulate utilities, and we, as a law, direct utilities to procure a certain amount of their energy from renewable or clean sources. And so as a result, then that drives projects as well. And now we're up to last year, 61% of all the electricity powering our economy is clean energy. And 168 days this year, for some portion of that day, 100% of our load was serviced by clean energy. So from my perspective, we're a state that's showing how to get it done while learning from others. Last point I'll make is there needs to be more of a conversation between government and finance because we speak different languages. And the education that I've received from your colleagues is we should, if we're going to regulate, if we're going to set policy, we need to do so in a predictable way and create sort of durable conditions in which to invest and innovate. So that's something that we're trying to do. But I think merging this conversation with the one across the street in the blue zone so that we really understand the ins and outs of what helps your companies. I mean, you are all on the vanguard of doing the right thing in these investments. What helps you actually do more of it at scale?
Thank you, Wade. And I think you prepared the perfect segue to Kristy. And Omer has also underscored the importance of regulation. Wade, we've heard the different elements that you've described that were essential in California. Now, Kristy, I'd like to hear from you, working with your clients on increasing their ESG portfolios. What is the role that regulation plays? What is the role that the laws behind all of what we're talking about are playing? Can you share some perspectives, please?
Thank you, and thank you so much for having us and to be able to speak and learn from all of you. And yes, I am the lawyer in the room, but I think to your point, that's a very important piece to all of what we're trying to achieve here. So my name is Kristy Balsanek. I'm the global co-chair of ESG at DLA Piper. We are a global law firm. We are 4,500 lawyers globally. We're in about 90 offices in about 40 countries around the world. And so our clients are global companies who are looking at these issues, who are really trying to understand from a regulatory perspective what this means for them, particularly because, as many of you know, they have been issuing commitments for many years, some companies voluntarily for many years, about their decarbonization strategy, about their human rights strategy, and all of these different areas under sustainability. And we're at a point that the regulations now are becoming much more mandatory in terms of companies now having to disclose all of the work that they're doing towards these commitments. And some of the commitments, as many of you may know, have gone ahead where perhaps they were a bit ambitious at the time because everyone was trying to demonstrate how committed they are to this. And now, given the seriousness of where we are with climate and the crisis we're under, they're really looking to understand from a regulatory perspective what they need to do. And that, a lot of this is how they're going to manage all the different frameworks that there are around the globe. We have some of our clients that are in 45, 65 countries, and they're trying to manage a strategy that really places sustainability in the strategy as a proactive point. And so the EU is driving a lot of this right now for the US. Companies who are headquartered in the US, many of you may know there's a corporate sustainability reporting directive that companies will have to start reporting, if they haven't already, on what they're doing in this space. And so that's driving a lot of companies, wherever they are on their sustainability journey, to reassess what are their commitments, what do they look like, what are they trying to achieve. And that's going to be meaning to look at their stakeholders and what type of expectations that they have and what that legal risk may be. And they're looking to see as well in the US, because we don't have a similar federal sustainability reporting requirement, but we do have states such as California who've decided to go ahead and say that they're going to issue regulations they already have in California on companies now having to disclose. And they're going to have to really also report on what type of marketing claims that they're making around these types of green claims that they're going forward with. So we're doing a lot of advice to really advise companies in that space. And for those who are investing, they're wanting to understand not only their disclosure requirements, but what are the rules in their own country. In the US, we have the Inflation Reduction Act that many of you are familiar with that incentivizes for private investment. But that, we have to see, businesses want certainty, right? And right now, the questions around what type of stability our regulations will have in the US, we're entering a new era with the election that we just had. I live in Washington, D.C., so we're very much following that very closely. And also what's happening globally, we do a lot of work to see what type of regulatory requirements there are in country, to your point, so you can understand what's happening on the ground to really make some decisions that are informative.
Thank you very much, Kristy. I will open this to the floor in a minute for questions, but I'll use my prerogative as moderator to ask a first question. Wade, you've been focusing quite a bit on the importance of carbon pricing, of emissions trading, and so on. I think, Omer, you also underscored it. I confess I saw Stefan wincing a bit when I said it's difficult to have silver bullet solutions. So I'm quite curious for the panel to tell me a little bit about the importance of carbon pricing, of possibly having a global carbon price on sorting out the financing issues.
Maybe because you invoked me, I'll go first. Look, I'm not about silver bullet solutions, and I don't think we spend the next 20 years trying to create a unitary system that everybody can buy into, because I actually think, what we're seeing with the COP right now is just how different it is, and frankly, how dynamic situations are within our own countries. To me, it's not whether there's like a sort of a unitary carbon price, but there needs to be incentives. There needs to be drivers, because if there's not, what's to take a country like our host country here that 50% of the GDP is oil and gas production, and what's the economic incentive to actually drive in a different direction? So to me, whether it's carbon pricing, procurement, some type of global standards, we need that. But I'm interested to know if you feel like that's necessary, particularly in what we know as a developing world.
Can I come in on this? It's really more a comment to everyone who is going to be negotiating around carbon pricing. First of all, I am absolutely in favor of carbon pricing, and I think CBAM is something that will set an example of how regional carbon pricing can work and be taken forward. As a private market representative here, if you put a price on something, people will try to arbitrage it. So as governments and regulators look to design, hopefully not a silver bullet, just keep that in mind.
I think at the end of the day, what's behind all of this is a recognition that we need to scale. We need to scale action, and we need to do it fast, right? Because we're all running out of time for any of this conversation to be material at the end of the day, because we're facing a point at which things are going to change indefinitely, and then we're stuck with it. So the issue here is, what can we do between now and that point, which some will say is less than 5 years, others will say less than 10 years, whatever. We don't have a lot of time. So what is it that we can do? Now, in that, scaling is absolutely critical, for sure. But let's recognize that we don't live in a homogeneous world. There are those that are better able to function in that scaled up world than those that are able to do so, given their economic standing. So we have to make sure that we lift the bottom up, as well at the same time as ensuring that those that do have the means scale, and scale fast.
I would add, I somehow disagree a little bit, because given that we need to scale and speed up, we need a real game-changing moment. And I strongly believe in financial incentives. The only scheme which I'm aware of is a more consistent, more harmonized, real credit, liquid, sizable certificate market in CO2 certificates. So how do we create it? The European Union is moving forward, California, China is now looking into it, Saudi Arabia is doing it. I think we would do the world something good if we could agree on minimum standards, what means a quality credit. And how do we ensure that the project which gets the recognition in year 0 keeps the quality until 30 years. We speak about very long-term projects, and therefore the certification is critical. And I think it would be good if in COP30 we would meet again and we would have achieved this beyond Article 6. I think that is really, really critical. Otherwise, I don't know how we price climate and biodiversity, and how do we transfer income into the developing world. Right? This debate is about the developing world, and they need stable sources of income, and biodiversity and climate could be a source of income and give economic and social progress. In the countries I'm visiting, the debate is of course around biodiversity and climate, but the core is social and economic progress. And we need to bring both debates together in these countries to be credible from my perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the insights. Just a quick question on carbon pricing. So I fully agree that it will take a long time probably to get a harmonized, unified carbon price on a global level. But on the other side, based on a survey, 80% of the investors think that climate risk is completely underrated in their portfolio, which is probably true. So my question in particular to the commercial banks, so Emily and Omer, so how do you consider, let's say, the underrated risk in your decision taking? Do you have an internal carbon price which you are using to avoid that the exposure will hit you someday?
So in terms of how we think about measuring carbon, particularly for hard-to-abate sectors, we actually have budgets associated with it. So rather than a carbon price, we have a budget for specific hard-to-abate sectors. And then we think about, for those hard-to-abate sectors, what does that budget look like in terms of tons of CO2, and then how are we going to manage that down over time? I think if I had to point to an interesting and provocative carbon price in my current hometown of New York City, I'd point you to Local Law 97, which has a $267 per ton price on carbon, and I think that's a really interesting place to start. But for Deutsche Bank, we manage on a pathway basis.
Yeah. So you guys can hear me, right? I think. Sorry. I feel like there's two different questions. One is, how do we think about climate risk? And I think that is separate from, how we are thinking about the price of carbon, because I view one as a little bit risk management. The other one is incentivizing behavior. So on the climate risk topic, that is forefront. We have a lot of focus on that and looking through our portfolio and understanding, what type of climate risk we have, what industries could be disrupted, extreme weather events, how that could affect the portfolio, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of, carbon pricing, I suppose, we're thinking about it differently, which is how do we ensure that we are talking to our customers about sustainability, and how are we prepared that when our customers are calling us and saying, I need to reach these goals, that we can help meet those goals for them. And incentivizing that our, coverage officers and our trading teams are all, fully in tune with having that knowledge base and being able to serve our clients.
Thank you. This is Kalpesh from India. My question is to Wade and Kristy. To Wade, basically on the biodiversity, there are multiple things corporates are doing, like solar and wind, because it's commercially viable and people are investing money and getting the benefit of ESG and carbon credit and all that. But in terms of the biodiversity, how the government is thinking, what policy they are making, what incentives they are planning to give to the corporates so that they focus on that also apart from their ESG goals. And to Kristy, I broadly wanted to understand on the governance point of view, how the government is liable for the biodiversity in particular area, what are the steps to be taken, and how the finance is incorporating all these two parameters. Thanks.
So answering the first question, some may know that there are 3 UN treaties that drive these COPs. We're at climate change. There's also one on biodiversity and desertification. And California is very active on the biodiversity COP. And I was in Colombia 3 weeks ago for that COP. And what's pretty interesting, and you probably know this, is there was a lot of energy focused with the business community. First of all, more companies came to this biodiversity COP than ever before. It sort of shocked the organizers. And there was a lot of focus on biodiversity credits and how do we actually help the countries that are the richest places in biodiversity in the planet maintain this biodiversity. And by the way, those places are also where the carbon is stored in our natural systems, right? So I'm really excited about that. And one thing that California, as a participant in both, is saying is we have to join this conversation because we can no longer, one, there's not enough money to do projects that solely focus on one or the other. And then two, we need to deconflict. So, it's a loss if we actually bring on renewable energy in a way that degrades our natural systems because as climate change accelerates, these natural systems degrade. And in a place like California, where a lot of my responsibility is wildfire, floods, droughts, we're seeing that we can't make this energy transition in a way that degrades our life systems. So I'll just say I don't think anybody's got the answer, but I'm really excited about the conversation that's evolving. I think it's harder to quantify, to build credits on biodiversity because it's so localized. But that being said, I'm hopeful that smart people in the world help us figure it out.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that there's more knowledge now around the biodiversity piece to this. And a lot of our clients now are coming forward and asking about the biodiversity and how they should be thinking about that with their own commitments that they're disclosing in their sustainability reporting. And right now, there's some voluntary frameworks that they do follow with the Task Force on Nature and Financial Disclosures. And so more clients are really asking about this. And the presence, as you said, our law firm was also on, we're not only here at this COP, but we were at the biodiversity as well, because our clients are there, they're asking how they should be thinking about it. And from a legal standpoint too, they need to be concerned on any greenwashing risks, of course, because if they're making some of these statements, they really need to be thinking about how they're going to demonstrate that they're actually doing what they're saying they're doing. And so we're really looking to see how we can progress on that as well.
Can I just say really briefly, I think government has a role to play building the credibility and providing political cover for the companies that are stepping up. We have incredible companies headquartered in California like Apple, Google, Meta, others that actually want to make these investments because they have ESG goals that they want to follow through on. And, you know, high integrity investments are tricky. And some of these companies, most of the attention that they get are from a limited number of groups that are just criticizing them on their approach. So one thing that we're committed to doing is supporting this conversation so that as entities are investing, private entities, they're doing so with some political support.
We have time.
I would like to add, this discussion was meant to be about developing countries. So California, you have a huge advantage, right?
Go a bit closer.
Therefore, I think we need to combine, from my perspective, biodiversity with the climate discussion. If we continue to have an isolated biodiversity discussion, and we are very active, we are the largest global financier in biodiversity, but only with 4 buildings, I don't think we will progress at the scale we need in biodiversity. And hence, everything which we could do, which is good for CO2 reduction, forestation, natural sinks, have a huge positive impact of biodiversity. So therefore, being pragmatic, combine the debate in order to accelerate and scale. There's a lot quick wins which we could do if we want, from my perspective.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Thank you. My name is Maria Jose. I come from Chile. We just, at our consultancy, we just carried out a market assessment for UNIDO, the Industrial Development Organization of the UN, and we assessed the capabilities of driving clean hydrogen projects. And among the 141 developing countries, we found 16 with a great potential. The thing is how to break the chicken and egg situation, right? Because developing countries need a lot of things that we don't have, and so who's gonna pay for that? KfW, we found that's doing a lot, and so from the private perspective, and I don't know anybody in the panel, how do we unlock this chicken and egg situation? Thank you.
Sure, I can start, and I think the new technologies have always been attractive areas for investment, and will continue to be. And I think that as energy transition continues, corporate strategies are aligned with that. And so as companies think about what their future strategies are and where they have both stranded assets or stranded business models, we do start to see, or we have seen investment there. Now, a lot of these investments that you're talking about are incredibly CapEx intensive, as we started the conversation. And so, through market cycles, how does that last and how does that accelerate? It may not be linear, unfortunately. So, it's just kind of the very frank reality.
Yeah, and I would say in order for hydrogen just generally to scale up, I think we need to see demand signals. So there is demand for hydrogen, but we're talking about producing a lot of hydrogen, and so we need the demand signals, which will then lead to offtake contracts, and then the capital will come as soon as you have the offtake contract. So I would say that's the first step. And then the infrastructure to transport hydrogen also needs to be figured out, right? I think that's been kind of when we've spent time on it, that's what we've struggled with, and that's not a developing market. I think that's everywhere. You have to actually transport it once you build it. The local uses of it are not as wide as people have been talking about.
Okay. I think time is almost up, but I'm very, very happy that we ended this panel by speaking about green hydrogen, because this allows me to invite you also tomorrow to come here at 2 o'clock, where we will be speaking about low carbon fuels and our new study, The Last Mile to Net Zero. So if you're interested in hydrogen, synthetic fuels and so on, rendezvous here tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And with this, I'll end the advertisement break, and I'd like to thank this fabulous panel for being with me here and the great answers.